Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I want to answer an eternal question of, are people whining about the judges at HEMA tournaments correct? Now, recently I went to the Revolution Rumble tournament 2024 and I did pretty badly. I went 5-3, which doesn't sound so bad probably to most people, but when you're probably the second or third highest rated person at the tournament, you do expect to do a little bit better. And one thing that I hear a lot when I go to tournaments is that when people do badly, especially when they do below their expectations, they try to find excuses as to why this happened. And sometimes, oftentimes, that falls directly onto the judges and directors. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go exchange by exchange like I always do and cover this particular fight that I had, which was the last fight I had in the loser's bracket of elimination. So spoiler alert, I lose. And I want to see whether or not the judging had a meaningful impact on whether or not I succeeded. Now, at the time, I'll tell you right now, I was really, really mad because I was doing very poorly and I wasn't getting exchanges that I thought I deserved. But I would say that it's more or less my obligation to think that when it's, the time and place. It's my job to try to perform my best when I'm doing an actual tournament. And when I walk away, I don't necessarily have those same feelings. But I thought this would be a pretty good exercise in, testing the veracity of my feelings at the time. So here we go. We're going to watch the exchanges and we're going to find out whether or not I got judge screwed. So for our first exchange, we start off with a pretty messy one, which is, of course, a bad omen for things to come, where my opponent goes at first for a cheeky little hand poke, and it looks like it makes contact with my glove, but given the angle and the fact that I pull my hands back, it doesn't look like it makes significant purchase, and we keep on fencing anyway. At which point my opponent feints a high attack and then goes for a low hand shot on my right side. I go for a little bit of a parry repost here, but it's not 100% clear what I land or where I land it, and it's all very, very messy. And it's given to me as a good, clean parry riposte, but when you rewatch the footage, it all works so badly. And one thing that I want to make clear here is that this is what pretty much every single one of these exchanges is going to look like. So for the second exchange, we have another really interesting and crazy one. My opponent goes for another cheeky hand snipe, which again seems to make a little bit of contact, and again I seem to be pulling my hands backwards. So if we were going to go off of the theory that my opponent was landing these, they've already landed 2 in a row. But we continue fencing, and my opponent throws 2 consecutive strikes to either one of my sides. I parry them both, and then I come in for the repost. However, I do something a little unusual. I do what I like to call delaying, which is after you get a repost and you're going in to try to counterattack your opponent, it can sometimes be very smart to delay your counterattack to wait and see exactly what kind of instinctive defense your opponent's going to put up. My opponent kind of hesitated and went up into a generic kind of cron parry, which prompted me to cut a little bit low and hit them in the side. At which point, when I come forward for this counterattack, my opponent throws his own counterattack at my head, which I attempt to duck. Now, if we watch the slow-mo, what I think is clear here is that, one, my cut to the body is a little bit flat. It's not really great. It's also worth noting that my opponent's cut to my head does appear to get very, very close to my head, but doesn't appear to really make contact. Now, when we move on into the judging, what happens here is that the judge and director give the point to my opponent, particularly because what they believe is that when I parried my second parry, that when I come forward and delay my counterattack, what I'm essentially doing is giving up my own attack priority. At which point, I throw my attack to the body and my opponent throws his attack to the head. Now, another thing to point out is that at this tournament, cuts to the body were low priority, which means that just because we had doubled here, which is what the judges and directors saw, means that my cut to the body is automatically given lower priority to any cut to my head or arms, which means that it doesn't really matter whether or not they considered my second parry to be within tempo of my repost, but it is a discussion worth having because it can be sometimes difficult to determine whether or not someone keeps attack priority or even counterattack priority, whether or not if they delay or do a bunch of crazy stuff in between their parry and their riposte. So Another really crazy exchange with another really weird outcome, but one in which my opponent waves off. And this is going to come up later because it ties into a discussion about waving off your own points. The third exchange is actually somewhat clear, at least compared to the previous two. My opponent throws a cut onto my dominant side, lands in my cross guard, at which point he decides he's going to try to drive the point forward and try to land a thrust to my head. I continue to raise my cron up higher and higher and higher until I get all the way up and over my head, thus parrying the thrust, and throw a counter left Zwerg to my opponent's head/arms. Now, watching the footage, it does seem pretty clear that my Zwergkow does land, and that it was, of course, in tempo as a repost after my parry. But despite this happening, and again, kudos to my opponent, no ill will here, he throws another cheeky little Zwerg after he gets hit, mostly just to make 100% sure that if for whatever reason my Zwerg was low quality, or the judges just didn't see it, he's covering all of his bases. And this is something really smart that I think a lot of people need to do, because there's a stigma about afterblows in that you can be Lee Smithing somebody and just afterblowing them really hard after the exchange in order to punish them. But what really should be happening is that you should always go to the hold and fence to the hold, meaning that if whatever you're intending to do is chambered when they say hold, you should finish it out and pull it. The idea being that sometimes judges miss things, sometimes the thing you think you got hit by isn't any good, and sometimes that little follow-up after what you think was certain death is the only way you get the best of certain really messy exchanges. So again, a really smart thing for my opponent, but in my opinion, this is just a clear point for me. The next exchange is another really clear one. My opponent manages to parry a ballistic thrust from myself that is a little overcommitted, resulting in him being able to Unterhau directly into my hands and my body, at which point I am continuing my momentum forward and basically go clean past him. And it actually would have behooved me a little bit to remember the advice that I had just learned from my opponent the exchange before, because if, for whatever reason, I had thrown a cheeky little Zwergkow after I knew I had almost certainly been killed by my own overextension, I actually might have come out on top, because if the judges had seen that my opponent had cut me to the body and I had thrown something to the head, I would have automatically got priority despite the fact that I had been cleanly parried and cleanly riposted. It's a little bit of a rules deliberation here, and one in which sometimes I can understand the idea of cuts to the body being deprioritized, especially when we watch things like Swordfish, where Zwergs and middle hows to the body can completely dominate and wash out almost every single exchange. But it does feel really bad when my opponent does something so clean and so pretty, and theoretically could have been cheesed out of it. Other than that, though, the judging is very clean. Point goes to my opponent. Nothing to argue with. The next exchange gets a little strange, but only in the theoretical. So my opponent comes forward with clear attack priority, chambers an attack, and throws it, at which point I try to perform some kind of matrix dodge where I angle my body in line with his cut in order to try to just completely void it. And it works out for me. As you can see from the slow-mo, my opponent gets very, very close, but never really makes any meaningful contact with any part of my body, making them just simply whiff over the top of my head while I come in for my counterattack. However, it's worth pointing out that if my opponent had made any meaningful contact on any part of my body, except, I guess, my legs or my torso, they would have gotten their point because they had a clear attack priority. And this is exactly the kind of fencing that most people would say right-of-way exists to try to disincentivize. This arguably suicidal dodge and counterattack by me is one that relies entirely on my opponent completely missing a cut to my entire being, which is very unlikely to succeed. It is, however, likely that I would be able to deprioritize his attack by making it go towards not my head and maybe my shoulder or my arm, which in a Nordic-style rule set might have resulted in me getting 2 points with my opponent only getting 1. And this is why right-of-way exists in counteraction to something like Nordic. What we want to do is try to deprioritize the kind of suicidal fencing that you're seeing me perform here and incentivize the kind of good, clean, I'm attacking and you must defend yourself style fencing that my opponent is doing. The next exchange is one that I'm a little bit proud of. It's a clean exchange. My opponent goes for my leg. I managed to do my classic dolphin step where I suck my right leg back all the way to my left leg but leave my torso hanging out in the air. And what that allows me to do is make a pretty clean headshot to my opponent's head. But in my opinion, that first one was a little bit flat and not so great, which is why I double it up with a second one. But I'm able to do that because after my opponent misses my leg, they are completely left open, they can't retreat out of measure, and they're unable to defend themselves, which means I can hit them twice in a row without any real fear. Clean exchange, nothing to really talk about as far as the judges. The next exchange is an interesting one because it's one in which I thought I got it, but did not deserve, at least at the time. Now, when you're watching this exchange, what happens is pretty clear. My opponent comes forward with attack priority. They go for a hand shot. I attempt to parry it and then throw my classic counter left Zverk and let my opponent just kind of walk past me. However, when you watch the footage first, and what I thought happened was I thought I heard and even felt some contact on my gloves. Now, given right of way and target priority, my opponent should get that point if they made contact with my glove, because no matter what happens, whether or not I hit their body or their head, if I'm hit on the attack and my opponent has attack priority, they get their point. And the judge says that the attack that my opponent threw was mostly guard and should be discarded. And when I watch the replay, I actually think this judge and director did a very good job, because when you watch it, what you see is that I kind of parry with my flat, which is usually a recipe for getting smacked right in the hand, because when a sword hits your flat, it slides down and generally hits your hand. But I got a little bit lucky, because when I turned my flat towards my opponent's blade, the bottom side of my crossguard managed to stick out just far enough to get in the way of my opponent's cut sliding down into my hands. So, to no credit to myself, I managed to bail myself out of that one with a really bad parry. But it's worth pointing out that this is an indication that the judges actually sometimes see things and understand things better than the fencers themselves. And this is again going to come back into play, foreshadowing-wise, when we talk about denying points. So for our next exchange, we have another rather pretty one, but one where there's some questionable contact. Now, my opponent throws a baited attack, which means he threw an attack with the clear intent of just letting it hit my crossguard, because so far he has understood that I'm a big fan of counterattacks and parry ripostes. So he throws that baited attack, and I fall for the bait. However, my opponent seems to have misjudged my distance a little bit. Instead of throwing my counter left Zverk as I normally would, I throw a Schielhau instead, which allows me to utilize my range a little bit better, and tag my opponent on the front of their jacket. Now, it's not clear from the angle of the camera whether or not I really got great purchase on this counterattack, but it is worth pointing out that the judges certainly thought so. And after that, and the tag hit is landed, my opponent still throws their conceived counterattack of their own, and they manage to get it a little bit past me, and we all get tangled up into a grapple. So again, kudos to my opponent, because managing to fence after what clearly looked like a little bit of a tag hit is another really good thing that a lot of people need to do, and maybe a little bit of kudos to myself for managing to parry a counterattack after I had managed to land a hit, which is when most people just drop their guard and drop their defenses entirely. And once again, the judging here does not deviate from this whatsoever. So you're probably wondering at this point why I even bothered to make the video, because so far the judging has just completely lined up with what happened. But it's worth pointing out that there were a ton of exchanges in this fight. The fight went on itself for almost 10 minutes. And what we're going to start seeing now are the things where the judging gets a little weird, the exchanges get even weirder, and the ability to determine an outcome gets very, very difficult. So in this particular exchange, my opponent comes forward with a kind of ballistic thrust that they try to wind up over the top, something that they're actually going to hit me with later on today. But unfortunately, their body obscures the camera angle, and we can't really see what they do with their blade for the intermediary period. Now, what I remember happening is that my opponent went for this winded thrust. They missed, and they attempted to come back around underneath and hit me in the hands. And you can kind of see that in the footage, where my opponent's point and sword basically disappears behind their body, right about the time that they don't quite land their thrust in the initial action. I throw my counterattack over the top, which appears to maybe hit the top of the hands, but also a decent amount of crossguard. And then suddenly you see my opponent's tip and sword reappear, having nothing really appeared to have happened on the right side of my body, the left side of theirs, without making any real contact, at which point we're both pretty much out of the ring. Now, it's worth pointing out that during the judging of this, the judge said that they thought that nothing of any significance happened before the ring out. And it's worth pointing out that in order for this to be true, both my opponent's initial attack and all of their attempted counterattacks after their blade disappeared behind their body and my counters Verk would have to all have been thrown out. And this is something that we're going to see happen a lot more as we watch these further exchanges. And in my opinion, the counters Verk did look good enough, but I can definitely see how, especially in the moment where things were confusing, that it just looked like it kind of skimmed over the top and didn't make any real purchase. Our next exchange is where we start to see some weird things start to happen. Now, no matter how many times I watch this exchange, I can't really say that it wasn't a good one. My opponent comes forward with an attack, I parry it, they follow up with another counterattack, I parry it a second time, and then I throw a right Zverk across the body line, hitting them in the torso. At the exact same time as this happens, after the second parry is made, my opponent pulls off, reorients their sword to their right sideline, and throws another follow-up cut. Now, in any understanding of right-of-way or even Nordic-style point differentiation, I would get 2 points for cutting to the body. My opponent would get 1 for cutting to the arm. In right-of-way, I made a clear secondary parry and then reposted, at which point my opponent simply threw another counterattack. The priority would go to me in virtually every single rule set that I could ever imagine. And unfortunately, the judge throws out the exchange. There is no real indication when you listen to the judging and the words that he says as to why, other than he said there were mutual hits to the hands and it got confusing. And this is one of those things where I never wanted to ever make a video where I critiqued anyone else's judging or directing. It was not something that I ever want to do because judging and directing is really, really hard and it deserves a lot more respect than it gets. And personally, I don't believe in judge screwing because at the end of the day, if you are able to hit and not get hit, that is all that matters. However, what we see here is a pretty clear case of the judge just making a mistake. But what I think it's important to point out here is not that the judge is bad, not that the director did a bad job, not that they should have known better, but that generally judge screwing comes in the form of thrown out exchanges far more than it comes in the form of giving a point to someone who didn't deserve it. In my opinion, right of way exists in order to make it so that interactions where a double happened get a score. And it really, first and foremost, serves to speed up a fight and give each fighter more exchanges to get the better of. Because in Nordic style rules where people double all the time, there tends to be a lot of exchanges where nothing ends up happening. And in right of way, that can't happen. However, it does say a lot that in a rule set that is primarily designed to resolve doubles, what we're going to see from these next couple exchanges is a whole lot of times where the exchanges are just thrown out. And in my opinion, this goes completely against the intention of a right-of-way rule set, because the whole point of right-of-way is to be able to resolve exchanges that otherwise would not have a clear resolution. And as much as it might feel bad to be on the losing side of an unclear exchange where it resolves in your opponent's favor, I think it feels even worse to be on the unresolved situational exchange where you thought you did well, or maybe you thought you did poorly, and the judge threw out the exchange because the complexities of right-of-way were kind of overwhelming. So I really don't want this to come off as me saying that the judge did a bad job. Again, I can't say that enough. But it does seem pretty clear here that there was a clear right-of-way way to distinguish the exchange here, and it was thrown out instead. Our next exchange is possibly the messiest and most difficult to judge exchange that happened during this fight. My opponent and I go back and forth, throwing baited attacks, changing our guards, trying to open up each other's defenses, at which point my opponent feints what I think is either a single or potentially even a double feinted Zwerk, and then throws eventually a low left Zwerk, which was going towards my hands. I, in my opinion, get a little bit lucky and manage to raise my hands and jump into the air just high enough to get that left Zwerk to pass underneath of my hands, at which point I go for a shuttle howl or a direct vertical cut straight down onto my opponent's head, which, all credit to my opponent, he manages to block. Now, when you watch the exchange in slow motion, you can see that just due to the general flexiness of the swords, my over attack does manage to make some contact on my opponent's arm, but this is only because the flat of the blade flexes in response to my edge, and I'm able to essentially cleave through a sword that would never realistically be possible. However, after that exchange, my opponent transitions back into their right side guard, and I preemptively lay my guard against their sword in order to push them into a disadvantageous position as they're coming forward, which does seem to work. My opponent is pushed off to their bottom right quadrant, at which point they throw a paltry kind of cut towards my leg, which appears to land a little bit flat. But in my opinion, this just wasn't even their intention. They were really trying to transition their guard from their right side to their left side, and they got stuck on my leg. At which point I throw what I was started off as a kind of left Zwerk, but I disconnected my left arm from the sword because my opponent had already begun to walk past me, at which point I turn my body and rotate and place my blade in one hand against what ends up being the back of their head. Now, when we go to the judging on this one, the judging takes a full minute, with a discussion between the judging and the directing and the both of us. Because what the judge saw here was a very unclear and messy exchange that ended in me placing the strong of my blade against the back of my opponent's head. And that was theoretically a yellow cardable offense for both of us. On top of that, we were both more or less out of the ring, theoretically, before the halt was called, which means that there are at least a few different ways that this exchange could be called, and a few different ways that this exchange could be thrown out. And thrown out is what happens. And again, we have to have a discussion about whether or not certain exchanges should be thrown out, whether or not them throwing out screws me or my opponent up. And the reality is that it's often way more impactful on an individual fencer's experience when something that they did that they thought was good doesn't get any credit, rather than something where both people did something that they thought was kind of bad and somebody got credit. And I make this distinction because, again, right of way is there to try to make sure that all exchanges end in something, and there should be very few exchanges where it ends in nothing. Although I am going to have to agree with the judge here, I do think this exchange deserved to end in nothing, because as weird as it was pretty clear that a lot of things only happened, A, because of a slightly early halt call, and because of a ring out, and because of 2 yellow cardable offenses. So while there might be a lot of people who would look at this exchange and say, you got screwed out of a point, I would not actually agree with them. Our next exchange is surprisingly clear and surprisingly stupid on my part. We come together, we both feint and exchange. I go for the leg without closing my line or retreating or doing anything intelligent, and my opponent just hits me. And the irony is that this is another interaction where, regardless of what rule set you were in, and including this one, my opponent got a point, they deserve a point, and I deserve to feel very bad for just attacking somebody's leg in measure and doing absolutely nothing about it. But what it speaks to is that it's at this point that I'm getting a little mad. And I'm getting mad because I'm feeling like, as we saw in some previous exchanges, that things I'm doing right are getting thrown out. And it's forcing me to do, well, not forcing me, but it's making me do some really, really stupid things that I wouldn't normally do. And what it's worth pointing out here is that when we started this out, this was supposed to be a discussion about whether or not you got judge screwed. But what I think really comes down to is that sometimes when you think you're getting judge screwed, you end up screwing yourself way more than any judge ever possibly could. because it puts you into a negative mind spiral where you think that because you're doing things that you think are right and aren't getting called for it, you start doing things that you think are normally wrong, and they end up being wrong. And you end up just doing things that you wouldn't normally do that are just patently stupid for no other reason than you're assuming right now in the state of the moment that if you just live an opposite day and you do the opposite things that you would normally do, then suddenly what you're doing is going to get called. And obviously it doesn't work like that. But this is what I think is the mental pattern people put themselves into when they think they're getting judge screwed. And it results in them getting judge screwed or just screwed even harder. So we come now to the part that I've been foreshadowing for a long time. And that is the part where I throw out one of my own points. Now, looking at the exchange, it's pretty clear that my opponent really deserves the point. However, it's an instance where we have to take into account the negative mind spiral that I've put myself into so far. My opponent comes forward, they throw a feinted attack to their right, and then moves to their left to try to attack my right forearm. A classic setup and attack that happens all the time. And, to my credit, I do something that I think is actually a pretty smart thing to do in this instance, which is not bite on the feint and instead throw a big, nice Zorn directly across my line into the line that I think my hand is going to get attacked on. And it doesn't work out for me because what I end up doing is punching my hand directly into the attack of my opponent and completely whiffing the cut that is supposed to simultaneously hit them in the head and zone out my hands. So I fail on both counts. But the judges try to give the point to me. One, because they think that the hand shot did not land, which it did, and that my cut did land, which it did not. And I throw out the point. And to anyone who is watching this and thinks that self-call tournaments are the way to go in order to fix HEMA tournaments, they might look at this and say, see, judges are wrong all the time and the fencers know best. And I would point out that yes, in this particular case, the fencers did know best. My opponent did know that they hit me in the hand, and I did know that I got hit in the hand. And I knew that my attack whiffed, and they knew my attack whiffed. But what you have to go back and look at is all the other exchanges that were thrown out and think about what would have happened if it was a self-call tournament. It is the obligation, in my opinion, of each fencer to stick to whatever things that they get. Primarily because it is their obligation to believe that they're doing the right thing and the smart thing in their exchanges, even when they're not, because they have to avoid at all costs getting into the negative mind spiral that I have put myself into during this fight. And it's primarily because of the results of this fight that I believe that negative mind space is so dangerous. And one of the ways that you can enter it is to get into this self-call honor mindset. Because the reason that I called this as a point for my opponent or threw out my own point is primarily because I believed that I owed him something from earlier on in the fight where he threw out one of his points that he didn't deserve. And it's such a dangerous place to be because despite the fact that it seems like the honorable and good thing to do, what it really does is it puts and reinforces in your own mind that the judges can't be trusted. And when you reinforce in your own mind that the judges can't be trusted, you are going to start believing that you're getting judge screwed. And worse, you're going to think that your opponent is being dishonorable and screwing you out of points because you think you're landing things that you may or may not be landing. The judges, who you've now thrown out all of their credibility, are not calling things that you maybe think have landed. And now you think that your opponent is denying things that you maybe think you have landed. So it makes you negative to everybody involved. It really pisses you off. It puts you in a terrible space. And in my opinion, it makes you a worse fencer. And what we're going to see now is that throughout the rest of these exchanges, I stop doing a particularly good job. I start losing. And the irony is that up until this point where things started getting messy, I was up 5-2 in a 7-point limit. I never scored another point. I lost 7-5 at the end of this. So from, I think, 4 exchanges ago, I completely shut myself off. I put myself in a bad headspace and I cost myself the fight. And it's entirely because of things like this. And I don't think people realize just how dangerous that mental space can be. Of course, it wouldn't be a video about getting judge screwed if I didn't have what I would consider a pretty clear-cut case of, unfortunately, getting judge screwed. My opponent threw an attack. I threw a counterattack. You could maybe watch the slow-mo and determine who exactly had the attack, but in my opinion, it didn't really matter because what I did was more or less perfect in my mind. I threw an Oberhow. I threw a right side cut that cleared my line. I got my opponent clearly into my cross guard, and at the exact same time, I delivered a cut to their head that hit them, bounced off of them, maintained a bind for a solid second after, at which point my opponent pushed my blade off to the side and presented a thrust because they realized faster than I had that the judges just didn't see it. They didn't see my cut to the head. And once again, as I've said toward the beginning of this video, you should always fence one exchange after or during the hold because this is what happens. Judges miss things. They thought my cut was parried. They thought my cut in opposition lost all of its momentum in the bind. And so when all I did was lower my defenses, pat myself on the back mentally, and just keep walking forward, my opponent capitalized, got an easy hand push off to the side, and got a free point. And it all happened because I was in this negative space where I thought that the judges were missing things, and this time they really did miss something. But because of that, I didn't follow up. And maybe if I had, I would have kept my attack priority, but maybe they would have thrown it out anyway because if they thought my first attack was parried, then anything my opponent did after was going to count. But once again, they didn't throw a cut afterwards. They were too jammed. They grappled. All I had to do was throw something, anything, in that moment, and I would have gotten the point I deserved, even though it might not have been for the attack I deservedly landed. And it's all because I thought I was getting judge screwed. And even now, when I am getting judge screwed, it's my own mental state that is causing this problem. So we're getting pretty far into the fight now. We're down to the last couple exchanges, though if you can believe it, there is actually 4 more. And we get to the point where I have hit a kind of critical mass in terms of anger. And we see that play out in the exchange pretty clearly. I throw a baited thrust toward my opponent. My opponent parries it. And similar to an exchange my opponent tried to set up earlier, he throws a slightly overcommitted counterattack, which I parry very hard, and then throw a really hard zverk to his body. At which point, my opponent, despite the fact that I have parried and reposted, simply pulls back and throws a pretty hard, but not really as hard, cut to my arm. A shot to my arm that only lands on my arm because my big Meyer lean off to my left side gets my head offline where it probably would have been smashed if it had left in its original position. And what's worth pointing out here is that once again, we have an iteration where my mental space is just getting to a real bad place. Because what happened here is that despite the fact that I had a very clean parry and would have had a very clean riposte, my desire to try to punish my opponent for all of the points that I have been getting screwed out of, forces me to go towards the body, which if you remember from earlier, means that it loses priority no matter what. And once again, I have given a free point to my opponent because I got mad. I wanted to land a big juicy hit and I forgot what kind of rule set I was fencing under, and I threw a big hard attack to a low priority target and I got punished for it. So there's nothing really to say about judging. They judge it accurately, but it is worth pointing out maybe that in a Nordic rule set, this would have been beneficial to me, but it's not a Nordic rule set, and I knew that. But I forgot that when I was stuck in a place where I was just really, really mad. Now, I'm not going to go over the next bunch of exchanges because it's basically just a repeat of this. My opponent does really smart things, they get really clean attacks, and I do really stupid things, and I just lose the fight. But what's worth pointing out here is that if we want to go into a summation here and we want to talk about whether or not judge screwing is real, yes, it is real. Real in the sense that judges can screw you out of individual points in individual exchanges. But what's really real about judge screwing is what it does to you as a fencer after you think you're getting judge screwed. And what it does is, as you can see, as happened to me, is it forces you, and not forces, but makes you change your fencing to a very, very bad degree. I lost this fight fair and square. Regardless of whether or not you think I deserve to have won it because too many of my exchanges were thrown out where I would have won and I would have gotten to 7 back when it was, 5-2 or whatever, doesn't really matter. Because what matters is that when you're a tournament fencer or when you're a fencer overall, you have to be able to account for the fact that things are not going to go your way. You have to be able to account for the fact that if you were fencing cleanly, if you were really better than the person you're up against, you'd be able to show any judge that you were able to land those clean hits. As you saw, anytime my opponent or myself landed a hit with absolutely nothing else happening, we got our points. When clean exchanges happened, people got what they deserved. It was only during these messy ones where we have this perception about who deserves what and why. And even when it's true, given the rule set, what happens is that you start second guessing yourself, you start second guessing your fencing, and you start doing things that you would never normally do, and it makes you lose something that is completely winnable, or again, arguably, you've already won. I lost this fight fair and square because I started doing stupid shit when I shouldn't have. Not because a judge screwed me out of 2 points that would have gotten me to 7, but because I screwed myself out of a mental state where I was capable of actually winning. I had basically accepted already that the judge was going to make me lose, and so I lost. And when people talk about mental states in fighting or combat sports, it's dangerous because they get into some very cult-like behavior and talking points, but this is one where I think that the mental state and the mental side of combat sports needs to be talked about a little bit more, because too many people go into fights and exchanges and tournaments already believing that everything they see around them is bullshit. And it's no surprise then that they tend to do very, very poorly, because why would you ever do well in something that you think automatically disproves your historicity or your authenticity? To all the people who go into HEMA tournaments thinking that they're just tippy-tappy sport bullshit, you're gonna lose. And you're gonna lose not because you are bad at tippy-tappy sport bullshit or because they're even not doing that. They might be. But because you have already lost before you walked in and you have set up a paradigm for yourself where the only way to win is to lose. And that's what I set up for myself. That's what I see far too many people setting up for themselves in their own tournaments and in their own fights. And it's far too often the kind of sentiment that I see online when discussing the veracity or authenticity of tournament fights. Because what people don't want to understand is that this mental side of sport has always been considered the part of sport that trains you for reality. Nothing about doing HEMA fighting makes you a real fighter, and I will stand by that forever. I don't care if I'm a real fighter. I don't want to be a real fighter. But one thing that I will say is that the ability to keep control of your mental state and the ability to not lose before you've lost and the ability to keep a winning mindset even when things are going wrong is genuinely something that will help you in other aspects of life, even outside of HEMA tournaments, but it can oftentimes be the deciding factor of a HEMA tournament. And if you are bad at that side of tournaments, that is all the more reason to train for them, not a reason to discard them. So, I'm off my soapbox now on what is probably the longest video I've ever made in a while. But if you'd like to see more stuff like this, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and call me a dirty sport fencer down in the comments with a nice essay-long paragraph. And I'll see you next week.